Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Future Oil and Gas 2021 conference. I'm Olivia Powis, head of the UK office at the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, which is the trade association promoting the commercial deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, which is referred to as CCUS, and an essential solution to deliver net zero emissions across industry, heat, power and transport. This morning's session on carbon capture, utilisation and storage is entitled The Good, the Bad and the Logical, and hopefully you'll come away from this session with an understanding of why it's the logical solution and integral to delivering net zero emissions. As we all now reflect and move forwards from the negotiations and activities at COP26, the industry stands ready to deliver emission reductions and put us on the right path for net zero. One of the main outcomes of the summit was the agreement of principles to underpin a global carbon market, which those of us who are championing CCUS are glad to see remains technology neutral. This sends a clear signal to countries that may have previously been cautious about the applicability of CCUS. I think it's worth noting that entering into the summit, of the 123 nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, submitted to COP26, only 14 included plans for CCUS, and we hope for this to now increase. However, and despite the watering down, the political agreement to phase down unabated coal provides a clear invitation to countries to look at the opportunity to use CCUS and carbon dioxide removal technologies in their revised NDCs, which will need to be updated during 2022 and resubmitted to the next Leaders Summit in 2023. Going forwards, the CCSA will be calling on the UK presidency to emphasise during the ongoing COP discussions the role that CCUS and greenhouse gas removal technologies such as BECCS and DACs will need to play if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And just a bit about background of CCUS in the UK. The industry has moved from strength to strength over the past 12 months. I think only a year ago, we were thrilled to see the Prime Minister's ambition to capture 10 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030 in his 10-point plan. The Climate Change Committee then published their 6th carbon budget soon after, setting out a need to be capturing 22 million tonnes of CO2 per year in their balanced pathway to net zero, so effectively doubling the target. And then last month, the government's long-awaited net zero strategy set out a target of capturing 20 to 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030. So really, in just 12 months, the ambition has increased up to threefold in the UK. CCUS has a huge role to play in delivering net zero in the UK and globally, and particularly as enabler of a number of different technologies: clean hydrogen production, greenhouse gas removals, heavy industry decarbonisation, and flexible low carbon electricity. It provides a solution that we can deploy now for the harder to decarbonise sectors such as steel, cement, refining, chemicals, ceramics, as well as supporting the development of greenhouse gas removals, which are essential for industries such as aviation, which will otherwise find it very difficult to decarbonise. If we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to deploy CCUS and greenhouse gas removals now and at scale. The UK is perfectly placed. We have significant geological assets. We have over a third of Europe's storage capacity off the shores of the UK, as well as skills and infrastructure from our world-leading oil and gas industries. If we act now and with the right regulatory and policy frameworks in place, we'll create tens of thousands of new jobs and have the opportunity to build up a UK-based supply chain with global reach as this industry expands rapidly over the next 10 to 20 years. With the UK government's recent confirmation of the first 2 CCUS clusters, that's HyNet in the northwest and the East Coast cluster, in track 1 of their cluster sequencing competition, the UK is now finally making progress, and we need to keep the pressure on and keep the pace fast to ensure that we deliver an industry at scale to deliver CO2 savings as soon as possible. I'm joined by 4 excellent speakers this morning who will each give an introduction to their business and focus on different aspects of the CCUS business before we move into a panel debate. We'll also have time for questions from the audience, so please do post them into the chat as we go through the session. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So, as our first speaker, I would like to introduce Syrie Crouch, who is VP at Shell. She is carbon capture, utilization and storage lead for Shell globally. She has the responsibility to develop and mature Shell's CCUS portfolio, and as such has oversight of the CCUS projects currently in operation, that she will talk a little bit about. She has 30 plus years with Shell, all within the upstream development of exploration lines and business. I think over to you, Syrie, and Syrie will give us a global overview of CCS. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia, and happy to join you all this morning to discuss CCS and actually how CCS can enable the energy transition going forward, including heavy industry, etc. I was going to use a few slides, so if you don't mind pulling the slides up. You can see this is titled CCS, a portfolio approach. I do think this is critical, that we actually have to look at this as portfolio. We have to look at it portfolio-wise, not just for individual companies such as the one I represent, but actually for the world and for heavy industry as well. If you could move to the next slide. I have to say, I always, when I see this, think Shell lawyers win for how many words can you get on one slide. Don't worry about it. Realistically, it says make investments based on your own thoughts and processes, not just on what I'm about to say. If you go to the next slide, Olivia just alluded to this, and I think you can't be thinking about or talking about CCS or indeed climate change without being very well aware of the IPCC climate change report that came out earlier this year, where basically they said we're at a tipping point, if you like. The key thing here is indeed, and you can see the darker coloured graphs, if you like, in the circles, we're at a critical point in terms of temperature rise, a critical point in terms of melting sea ice, increase in sea levels, etc. And the best case is that we're working to limit this to 1.6 degrees. But to do that, you basically need a drastic reduction in the levels of CO2, methane, NOx and SOx, basically. In 2015, we had about 40 gigatons were emitted. It's recognised this needs to halve by 2040 and be zero by 2050. At the moment, that is expected to limit the temperature rise to 1.6 degrees centigrade. And thereafter, it should, in theory, start falling to 1.5 by 2100. If we don't take action, then indeed the temperature will increase to about 2.5 to 3.5 degrees centigrade, and sea level rise would be expected to be between 3 and 6 meters. With the current pledges, and this is prior to COP, the best estimate was that we get to 2.7 degrees centigrade rise. So the whole thing here is the recognition that there's a call to arms and a call to action in terms of reducing the CO2 output and to impact climate warming. The key thing here is there's multiple ways to do this. And the challenge is actually we need to pull all of those levers. So we need to pull the lever of wind, solar, hydrogen, etc. But actually, we also need to pull the lever of CCS. And the critical thing here is it tends to always have been discussed and left as the last option. But the key thing in the chart with the bar graph, what you can see here is it doesn't actually matter how much we pull those other levers. There is always a requirement for CCS. So the bar charts are all different versions of climate change scenarios. And the difference is how hard we move towards wind, solar, renewables, etc. And in the best case, you need 3 gigatons of CCS. In the worst case, you still need up to 12 gigatons of CCS per annum. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I always sat there, what on earth, how can I visualize what a gigaton is? Well, if you put the world's population on a scale, we weigh half a gigaton. Our annual meat consumption is about a gigaton. And the current oil and gas industry is 5 gigatons. So what this is basically saying is that come 2050, we need something roughly the size of the current oil and gas industry but with the molecules flowing in reverse. And that is, like I say, it ranges between 3 and 12 gigatons, but either way, it's massive. And the key thing here is, with that massive challenge also comes opportunity, and opportunity if we look at things and we think about things differently. So if you go to the next slide. The next slide here is really talking about how do we actually therefore develop CCS, and how do we utilise it to accelerate decarbonisation. So the key thing here is, what I'm talking about is CCS as a hub, and CCS as an industrial hub. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the slide to the left, what you can see are there are 6 key elements that we consider in talking about a CCS industrial hub. The first one, not surprisingly, starts off with net zero emissions from our own operations. So actually, how do we reduce the intensity of our own operations? And that's where CCS had traditionally been put in a box, which is it's a license to operate thing. It's something just for the oil and gas industry. However, if you look at it and you broaden from there, what you can sit there and say is, well, actually, there's capture from gas-fired power plants. So that's what I mean by low carbon gas to power. Then indeed, there's the recognition that hydrogen is a growing market force, if you like. Now, while people want to get to green in the long term, that's a heck of a ramp up. And there's a huge power requirement to get to green. And there's an intermediate step, which is actually blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is where you split hydrocarbons, you take the CO2, you capture it, you store it underground through CCS, and you're left with a very clean burning fuel. So that's low carbon hydrogen. There's bioenergy with CCS. Olivia referred to BECCS. This is one of the routes through, where actually in processing biofuels, you capture the CO2 released during the processing, you get negative emissions. The other way for negative emissions is direct air capture on the right-hand side. And then finally, there is working with heavy industry and our industrial partners to help decarbonise heavy industry, things without an easy, obvious solution, such as steel, cement, chemicals, etc. On the right-hand side, you can see, what does this look like? What does this look like for our refineries, where indeed we can bring in gas processing, we can then work with cement, power, steel, we can do the blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, etc. On the top, in the little map, you can see where are we actively working. These are the ones we talk about publicly. We have Quest, which has been in operations now for 6 years, storing 1 million tonnes per year. It's now at about 6.6 million tonnes, 99.7% uptime. That is absolutely critical, because the more we're going to work with manufacturing processes, etc., you need to know that you've got a very stable scenario that's not going to, if you like, trigger the other industries coming down, etc. We've got Gorgon. Gorgon in Australia is operational about the 4 million tonne mark. We are a non-operated partner. It's operated by Chevron in that case. We are then in 3 of the clusters in the UK, Acorn, Net Zero Teesside, and the South Wales Industrial Cluster. We're in Northern Lights. That's where indeed it's operating CCS as a service to industry. There is none of our own emissions associated with that one. We're a customer in Porthos, and we are working with on Aramis. I have to say, Total, who's also on this call, is our partners in several of these. So it's good to see that one as well. You go to the next slide. One of the other pieces that I always like to talk about is actually, how do we move away from the current subsidized world into a world where market forces start playing a key role? And this is where indeed you can sit there and say, well, yes, we've got the capture, transport and storage, and that's how we reduce those CO2 footprints. But actually, it's now let's look at what comes out of that manufacturing process, and how do we start putting a value on that lower carbon hydrogen, low carbon chemicals, plastics, decarbonising sectors, which means low carbon cement, steel. And the key thing here for me is actually looking at one of the things we're all educated in for energy efficiency is the A to G rating that we see on the back of our fridges, our houses even, in terms of how do you actually make sure you're buying a better product. Well, we can look at the same thing with carbon intensity for products where you're using either CO2 or CCS, sorry, or another mechanism to reduce that carbon intensity. And as countries, companies, ourselves as consumers sit there and say, no, I've got a net zero emissions target, then it will drive a price premium on those lower carbon intense products, because that's actually what we're going to have to be purchasing to actually create that net zero or meet our net zero targets. To do that, then actually what we will need is indeed that metering, that assurance, that allocation, if you like, of CO2 against those products. And that's where things like blockchain, digital can come in to actually assure us that we are buying that lower carbon intense product, and therefore we can use it to measure what our footprint is going forward. And the more people actually sit there and put in those net zero targets, the more a system, a complete holistic system like this will be required. That's probably where I want to leave it at the moment, and I look forward to the debate and hopefully lots of questions.
Thank you very much, Syrie. That's a great overview and introduction to what Shell is working on. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Federico Giannangeli, from Repsol. And he's E&P Director of Technology and the Operating Model at Repsol, and currently leads a multidisciplinary organization with a strong focus in value-driven technology product development applications to the upstream portfolio. He spent 18 years in the energy industry with primary contribution in delivering global oil and gas developments. So over to you, Federico.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for the introduction. And also, Syrie, you have perfectly set the stage for the conversation that we have today. So I would like to talk to you about bathtubs, superheroes, and cocktails. And this all in the context of NET, meaning negative emission technologies. So in simple words, I actually was looking into a TED Talk, and this was this company, Carbon Engineering, actually presenting and making an analogy. Carbon Engineering, by the way, is a company that is working in that, presenting an analogy on how all this CO2 in the atmosphere is working. And the bathtub was a concept of the atmosphere, and they were talking about, well, you have the tap, and you are opening the water is now representing the CO2, and then suddenly, I mean, you find yourself overflowing the bathtub. And okay, that's the big problem that you have. That's the same in regards to the maximum allowable CO2 that our atmosphere can have. So the tap is a way to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is historically what we have been targeting the reduction. But the good part of the bathtub is that there is a plug in there. And the concept of the negative emission technologies is that you can activate that plug and actually start balancing the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere by creating that negative effect. Okay, an important message that is behind this key analogy is that even though the negative emission technologies are a great opportunity, I'm talking like a series actually, is part of the portfolio of solutions that we have, all the reduction efforts that we are having in the industry and in the global, as a global citizens, in regards to managing the CO2 in the atmosphere are key. Okay, so this is one more part or one more ingredient of the solution. So if I move to the concept of, well, what is the size of the challenge? How big is this gap? I mean, how much is to be drained? And I was having actually a debate with some colleagues about this, and I kind of find the answer to this in two different paths. No, one is pretty straightforward, and it's actually what is showing the different climate reports, call it the IPCC, the IEA, some of the Wood Mackenzie's, and is that we're starting to see in the picture that by 2050, in order to reach the commitment of the net zero, we have around 5 to 10 gigatons of CO2 to take out from the atmosphere with NET, with those negative emission technologies. So that's a fact, and actually Syrie talked about in the CCS component. But the other part is a little bit more statistics or experience. I mean, when you think about project development, and you see similar project, industrial project performance in regards to cost and time. If I focus on the time piece, you can see that historically our projects has been delaying around 20% in similar projects that are associated to these ones that we have to face in order to mitigate the CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you apply that to all the reductions initiatives that we're having, which is, for example, projects in the hydrogen projects, everything that is associated to energy transition, e-fuels, renewable energy, which is key. I mean, you can expect that the second answer to that question is that the 5 to 10 gigatons of required CO2 negative solution is likely to increase. Okay, so the size of the challenge is not only about volumetric. I mean, we have a multidimensional problem to solve in here, and it requires speed. I mean, capacity to store. We're going to need to go through certification of the emissions to understand actually the life cycle, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 of our CO2. We're going to need to improve the project management part, and on top of that, I mean, the renewable energy is actually super key to be developed a fast track, because at the end of the day, when you are going and introducing technologies as a DAC or as a BET in which you need to do the storage, there is an energy requirement in order to do that. And that energy requirement needs to come from renewable in order to make that CO2 neutral. So what is the good news behind all of this? Well, we have some superheroes already in there. And when I mention about the superheroes, is because I'm going to talk about specifically about 3, because technologically speaking, they are at the point of maturity that are being implemented, or they have reached the point in which we can, as an industry, individuals, and in a different ways, scale them up in parallel. The 3, I mean, were mentioned by Syrie, actually. I mean, I will start with what we call like NCS. This is natural climate solutions. This is a simple concept. No, it's based on the biomass, and therefore the reforestation principles, in which trees actually capture the CO2 through the photosynthesis and is kept as a biomass in the tree, so that absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's it. There is other, of course, technologies that are not. When I say about technologies, because this is not only about just planting trees. I mean, there is a lot of development of technology around it to ensure that you can efficiently develop this type of plantations, let's say. The good and the challenge of this is that, well, the good is that it's a pretty low cost. Actually, is you come and visit Spain, and of course you stop into Repsol.
We've just lost Federico mid discussing the trees in Spain. We may lose him for a couple of minutes. So I think what would be best in this point is if we move on to our next speaker, to David Nevicato, and if Federico comes back on, then we'll bring him on once David has finished. So I'd like to introduce David. He's from TotalEnergies, and he's going to talk a bit about, so we've heard from Syrie about the scale that's required of CCUS, the role that it will play. Federico was talking about those negative emission technologies, and David is going to talk a little bit about how to finance these projects, and with some reference to the Northern Lights project that they are involved in. David is an experienced professional in the refining industry. He's got over 26 years in research, process, operation, and human resources. And his new business development team is developing the next CCS full-scale projects of the TotalEnergies after Northern Lights in Norway, Aramis in Netherlands, and the Net Zero Teesside Northern Endurance Partnership in the UK. So over to you, please, David. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Olivia. Could you share the slide, please? So, next slide, please. So, well aware that TotalEnergies are part of the solution to mitigate climate change, TotalEnergies announced its ambition to get to net zero emission by 2050, together with the society and its global business across its production and energy products used by its customers. So our initial CCS chain will be for CO2 emission, for LNG, blue hydrogen, refineries, and the competitive cost incremental of CO2 tons will be much lower to propose to the third party or to our energy customers. The resulting storage would gradually benefit from the scale-up effect. So each future expansion will thus result in the phasing out of the required state support. Indeed, your view is that CCUS should ultimately reach commerciality without state support. Our CCUS action are focused now on Europe, where our goal is clearly to prove the CCUS business model at an industrial scale. Business development will be done in other parts of the world to prepare the next wave of projects where our European experience could be replicated and scale up with the necessary adaptation in these countries. In Europe, it's clear there is clearly, we say, supportive European context for CCS. There is a favorable regulatory policies, a directive, European directive on CCS, London Protocol. There is a different subsidy scheme for capture facilities as a European Innovation Fund, and we have just announced the 7 project awarded by the Innovation Fund yesterday. The Dutch SDS++ is a mechanism to have a leverage on CO2 price, and in Europe there is storage facility as in Norway. In addition, the ETS, emission trading scheme, and national carbon taxes could provide additional leverage. But you could see in Europe, it's very important that we have very concentrated CO2 industrial emitters. Take example in the Netherlands. And it's a way for us to develop synergies between CO2 emitters for sustainable CCS share. And so TotalEnergies has expanded this effort via several major C projects. One is Northern Light in Norway. It's the first worldwide commercial CCS commercial chain. In Antwerp, in Belgium, one of the main CO2 hubs in Europe, the Aramis and the other project in the Netherlands, respectively the CO2 storage in depleted gas field and blue hydrogen in your refinery in Zeeland refinery. And finally, Net Zero Teesside and the Northern Endurance Partnership in UK, respectively the CO2 capture coupled with gas-fired power generation in the dispatchable mode, and CO2 storage in a deep saline aquifer in the UK offshore. Now, a few figures on investment needed to develop CCS at scale and align with the carbon neutrality scenarios taken by the different countries and Europe. CCS will need to be ramped up from 40 million tons per annum in the world today to around 1 gigaton of ton CO2 per annum. It depends on the scenario. We say less 1 gigaton. And if you consider that a capture project is around 0.5 million tons per annum each, and one storage project is around 5 million tons per annum, is what you see in Europe. How many capture projects are required? We need, in fact, 1,700 capture projects and 117 storage projects. And what is the rate of investment in year required? So for a 1 million ton per annum CCS project, it's around 1 billion euros. That means that the cost of the capacity for 1 ton of capacity is around 1,000 euros. So if you want to achieve 1 gigaton of the CO2 per annum over the 10 years, you have to invest around 1 billion euros per annum in terms of the investment. So it's a very huge. And so the climate challenge for us is that the business model have to be enabling the decarbonization of the economy. And we have to find the way to have a rapid and sustainable growth for this new industry. Could you share the next slide, please? A public-private partnership is already being formed in many countries and mainly in Europe to define the most appropriate ways to launch and sustain the massive investment needed for the decarbonization. I will take the example of the 3 countries where we are project. The first is Norway, and you see in Norway, as it is the same for the Netherlands and UK, there are 2 pillars. One is the carbon price, and the second is the support mechanisms. In Norway, the carbon price, there is a target to have around 200, more than 200 euros per ton, including the ETS, by 2030. It's clear that at this level of taxes, we could provide for CCS project a way to have a more sustainable business. In the same time, there is a current framework for the carbon tax and the ETS for the offshore oil and gas facilities that promote to capture the CO2 in these facilities. In addition, there is a support mechanism that the way the government of Norway reserve capacity and in exchange of the subsidies for the capex and the opex for 10 years. It's what was done for the Northern Light project, and with that, 80% of the funding coming from the Norwegian government for the investment of for the Northern Light project phase 1. And so the Norwegian government reserves the right to set the storage capacity for the 2 industrial sites in the Longship project. One is the waste recovery energy facilities in the Oslo municipality, and the other is a cement plant from Heidelberg. And we will, and the Northern Lights project will substantially increase its storage capacity to accommodate more CO2 from the other European emitting sites. It's a way to develop and to scale up this business and to go without the support of the government. In Netherlands, there is the same mechanism with a carbon price. It is less in Norway, but it is very important level of more than 120 to 150 by 2030. And in addition, there is a mechanism, it's a CDS++, is a contract, we say, for difference on the value of the CO2. And the funding of, by this way, we are funding 100% of the difference between project cost and CO2 price, with a cap of 156 per ton for CCS. In the UK, for the Northern Endurance Partnership and Net Zero Teesside, we have different support of the mechanism for this project. So first is a contract for difference mechanism for the power generation with CCS, and this power will provide low carbon power. And for that, they could the government will purchase at a fixed price the electricity, and for the other part is concerned the CO2 hub and the CO2 storage, and it will be on the regulated asset base mechanisms. It's a way to fix a return of rentability for this project. Next slide, please. In addition of the government support, carbon market revenue could play an important role in unlocking CCS investment and scale up the mitigation potential of these opportunities by providing much needed financial incentives to make such technologies economically viable and ensure robustness and deployment. So tapping carbon market potential requires robust carbon accounting methodologies to be developed and approved by carbon credit standard bodies. Currently, such methodology only exists on a very limited basis, both geographically and scope-wise. In response, a number of leading industrial players, including TotalEnergies as a founder member, have established a CCS Plus initiative to develop a methodological concept to the full suite of the CCS activity. The objective of the CCS initiative is to unlock and scale up the CCS-related climate action in carbon market, with an initial focus on project-based methodologies for the voluntary carbon market and Article 6. The voluntary carbon market alone is expected to grow to an annual market size of 5 billion to 50 billion by 2030, according to the Task Force for Scaling of the Voluntary Carbon Market. And the Paris Agreement architecture and the mitigation targets that countries have pledged in the context of their nationally determined contribution also require tools for a solid accounting of emission along the complete CCS value chain. That is sufficient source of the fuel, CO2 capture, transportation, and storage. At the national and international level, including the transportation content solution. So the verified carbon standard, the VCS, is the world's leading carbon crediting platform accounting of the 2/3 of the whole voluntary carbon market transaction volume and playing a growing role within emerging compliance market. So the VCS has approved a dozen of GHS methodology and registered 100,000 projects in 80 countries covering all the major GHS mitigation tools. So the CCS Plus initiative aims to produce a coherent, high quality and high integrity methodological framework, including a full suite of a VCS methodology and tools for accounting for credits CCS Plus at project, and the national and at the international level. So this methodology will be immediately usable for the voluntary carbon market, but could also be tapped for other regulatory regimes around the world, including the Article 6. Just to conclude, I will just financing CCS project and building sustainable business model required to identify the suitable funding framework and revenue model with a matching between CO2 emitters and CO2 storage capacity. If you want to back to the Norway, the Northern Lights joint venture market is available storage capacity to other CO2 emitters. And this is strongly linked to the subsidy scheme being implemented in many European countries and to bilateral agreement following the export of CO2 for geological storage and recipient countries. So Northern Lights GV is a precursor project in Europe, and discussion is already well advanced with industries that emit a lot of CO2 and showing a growing interest in storing their residual CO2 and thus making storage one of the solutions for deep decarbonization of the industry. The increase on storage volume will reduce the cost for all the CCS chain and for CO2 emitters, and it will add a value for the low carbon product for this industry, for the cement, for the steel, for the hydrogen, and should gradually enable manufacturers to offset the cost of their decarbonization. And at the end, CCS should reach the stage of commerciality without the government support.
Thank you, David. Oh, I got a slight delay. That was a really useful overview of the various different models that we've got in operation at the moment, and the plans of the size really of where we need to get to, and the likely overall cost. We have lost Federico still, so I think we'll move on with our next speaker, and I'll introduce our final speaker, and we'll go back to Federico after that. So I'd like to introduce Zomo Fischer from Lundin Energy. He is VP for Sustainability for Lundin Energy and responsible for their sustainability strategy covering environmental, social and governance issues. His core focus is to maintain their position as a leader in the energy transition and to create shared value for both shareholders and wider society. Lundin, so we've heard about the role of CCUS, the negative emissions, covered the investment angle, and now Zomo is going to cover the importance of a good policy and regulatory framework in setting all this up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and to Future Oil and Gas and the Cavendish Group for letting me speak today. It's a real pleasure to talk to you all virtually. As Olivia said, I'm going to focus a bit more on the importance of good policy and good regulatory frameworks to help us scale up CCS. I think the world is heading in the right direction here. We had some really positive signals from COP26, but as Syrie mentioned earlier, where we need to get to in terms of the scale of CCS investment and deployment, we really are quite far off today. And there's a huge imbalance that we have to close the gap on. And I think we've talked a little bit about the size of the challenge. We're capturing around 40 or so million tons per annum today from CCS projects, and for us to get up to maybe 5 or 6 or 7 gigatons per annum in 2050, according to the IEA, that's like nearly 200 times what we are capturing today. So it's really a huge challenge. And it's of a huge importance for those industries that are very difficult to decarbonize. If you look at cement, steel, chemicals, without CCS, there are other options. There are electrification options, for example. But if you look at the increased demand that we will have for electricity in the future, with the growth of electric vehicles and what have you, it's difficult to see how we're going to be able to electrify all of industry whilst also ensuring that everybody has access to renewable power for their cars and their houses, etc. So I think CCS is going to still be a very important part of the role to help those industries to continue to provide, the products that the world needs, but to do so in a zero carbon manner. And the costs per ton of CO2 capture today are still high, and we've discussed that a little bit today. I think some of the panelists on this session today will have a good overview of their direct experience in how much it does cost to capture CO2. It is really complicated because there are different players in the value chain here. You've got the carbon capture element, you've got transportation and temporary storage, and you've got the final storage as well, and re-injection. Each of those has complex cost structures, and at Lundin Energy we've looked at this from an R&D angle, and we're seeing costs between $50 up to $200 or even higher dollars per ton. And over time, of course, these costs will go down, and innovation, technology, digitalization will all help move this in the right direction. And of course, as David mentioned earlier, in Norway and in Europe in general, there is a very strong price signal from government and from policy that helps to incentivize these projects to continue. The EU ETS cost today is around 66 euros, so about $75 per ton. In Norway, we pay an additional carbon tax, and as David said, the total carbon tax that we will pay is going to be around $250 per ton in 2030, which means that a lot of these CCS projects do become, hopefully, economically viable, if not already today. So, there are a few different incentives that we can talk about and policy frameworks. One is to increase carbon prices and carbon taxes, of course. One that I'll talk a bit about is the scaling up of the carbon markets as a mechanism to really incentivize CCS. And of course, we do have subsidies and we have grants today that have helped, especially in the US, for example. But I think a combination of these options will probably be the best approach to get the scale that we need. So if we start with the carbon markets, first of all, I think this is where we saw some really positive outcomes from COP26. One of the contentious issues at the negotiations over the past 5 years has been how to account for emission reductions between different nations that want to then trade carbon credits in order to help them achieve their net zero goals. And the Paris Agreement, originally 5 years ago, had set the framework for how this international carbon trading should work under what the so-called Article 6 rules. But they hadn't really gone as far enough to really define the guidelines and the rules for how this would work in practice. And that's what we saw from COP26, which is actually a surprise for me. I think none of us really was expecting the rules to be defined in such level of detail. It is a first step, but I think it's definitely moving in the right direction after 5 years of haggling and negotiations. And what the guidelines essentially state, in a nutshell, is that countries that are hosting an emission reduction project in their country, whether that's a renewables project, a tree planting, or a carbon capture project, they will have the choice as to whether to account for those emission reductions towards their own net zero goal and their own carbon reduction commitments, or to export those credits to a buyer or to another third country. And in the case of an export, a corresponding adjustment needs to be made to their registry to ensure that these exported credits are not counted by the buyer and also by themselves. And so that was the key issue that was resolved to some extent at COP26. And what that means is it's pretty significant, because it gives project developers, whether they are looking at CCUS or renewables or other kinds of negative emission technologies, it gives them the confidence to now invest in a big way, and it's given people like us at Lundin Energy the confidence to play a greater role in the carbon markets, and to channel the billions of dollars that we will need to scale up the markets, as David mentioned earlier. Corporates who are active in the voluntary carbon market, who've set net zero goals, like many people on this panel and ourselves at Lundin, can now ensure that there is some confidence around avoiding double counting and being able to make claims around net zero and carbon neutrality that are more robust and that are more credible. And I think CCUS technologies, as David said, these are prime targets for the offset market, because today they are less economic and they do generally require incentives. We need to move away from that over time, and we need to eliminate subsidies over time to make them economically viable in their own right. And this is the exact space where the voluntary markets can help. If you look back to 20 years ago, renewable energy technologies were much more expensive than they are today, and they required subsidies. They required carbon markets and revenue streams from carbon credits to make them economically viable. And I think now we've seen the costs decrease, and so renewables have sort of largely left the offsets markets in certain countries, because they are now able to sustain themselves in their own right. And I think we're now at this pivotal point where CCUS technologies can enter the carbon markets, because they are a little bit like how renewables were 20 years ago. They still need some help, and they will, using offset mechanisms and the methodologies that are being developed, as David mentioned, the CCS plus reference methodology that's moving forward from the VCS. This helps us to properly account for the CO2 that is being captured, to quantify it, to monitor it over time, and to eventually deliver revenue streams from the CO2 that has been captured. And it's those revenue streams that will help investors reach the rate of return that they need to push those business cases past the criteria for their investment thresholds. So, my view is that the advancement of the carbon markets will really help us to eliminate and to have less reliance on government subsidies, perhaps in the longer term. It's not going to happen overnight, of course. But I think it's also really important to touch on, carbon taxes. And as has been mentioned before, in Norway, we have very high carbon taxes at Lundin Energy. For us, that has meant that electrification of our offshore assets has become economically viable. And in fact, we have very little CO2 left that's emitted that we can capture. So I think looking at avoidance and stopping the emissions at the source as well is a key tool in this puzzle to help us get to net zero, alongside CCS, for where the cost of abatement is still too technically not feasible or too expensive. And I think before I finish, I just want to talk about what Federico was discussing before he got cut off, which is around the natural carbon capture space. At Lundin Energy, we see that natural carbon capture solutions, reforestation, afforestation, seaweed, mangroves, all of these technologies are today quite cost effective and can help us achieve a lot of scale in CO2 removals. And I think they sit very importantly alongside CCS, and we can't leave them behind, because they have other benefits in terms of biodiversity, livelihoods benefits, and they are, they're already certifiable, and they're already delivering offset reduction technologies. They're already delivering revenue streams for players. And so for us, we're investing about $50 million in reforestation projects that are high quality, that are on degraded land, so they don't interfere with competition for other resources. And we're hoping that alongside CCS can really push the market forward and help us all reach the net zero goals of corporates and of nations, if done correctly. So I think with that, I'll hand over back to Olivia, and I look forward to discussing with you in the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Zomo. And I think that sort of very neatly segues back to Federico, who is now back online, who was just speaking about natural solutions and afforestation, I think, when you got cut off. So that was the final bit that we heard. So perhaps, Federico, if you want to take over at that point, I think I'll hand it back over to you.
Perfect, and thanks. I apologize for that so much. You put it easy to me because yes, I was talking about the first superhero, and it's like you stated. I was actually in the point of describing the good and the bad of that. I mean, the afforestation, reforestation, and other solutions in this line are the quick wins. They are fast deployed technologies there. There's some challenges. Actually, you can see some of the Microsoft lessons learned report about this, in which they have a limit extension of let's say of effectiveness, which is around 100 years when you're talking about that. But I mean, on the other side, is pretty low cost. I mean, I was mentioning that if you come and visit to Spain, and you of course sit down and fill your car gas in a Repsol station, you will have the opportunity through an app actually to offset the CO2 associated to the emissions of your trip, and the company will give you, 50% of that offsetment is going to come from the company, and the other 50% will come from a voluntary decision. And this voluntary part is going to be interesting for later conversations. And but long story short, this is all tied to that afforestation, reforestation projects, like Zomo also mentioned in Lundin, that they have, and also a lot of our companies have. The second one was in the line of BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture storage. So this is important. The bioenergy is just basically picking back from the previous one. I mean, as I mentioned, the CO2 is capturing in the trees as a biomass, and then that biomass with 3 different technologies, you can decide just go and generate electrical energy solutions with the capturing of the CO2 with different technologies of capturing, and but on top of that, you can also use sort of gasification technologies in order to make of that biomass fuel that can be used into other vehicles. The important of on the good and the challenge and the bad of the BECCS is that on the good side, it can contribute around 3 to 4 gigatons on the 2050. You might remember that I said, the size of the gap is from 5 to 10, and it's likely to increase when I mentioned about the analogy of project development delays. But BECCS plays a really important role in there. The challenge is that there is something that is called like CO2 leakage. So when you see the value chain of doing BECCS for the time that you are doing afforestation, so the fertilizers, the heavy machinery that is used to eventually cut the trees, etc., and other pieces of the process, all of these consumes energy, and the energy source, depending on what it is of course generating a footprint too. So when you see the full picture of the value chain, the BECCS actually sits in like a 50% effectiveness of storage. But in any case, my message in there is that we need to work much more in details how we account for the CO2 in terms of following the total footprint from the value chain. And the third one of the superhero, which is the DAC, direct air capture and storage. We have seen a lot of this technology in the public domain. There is today around 9,000 tons of installed capacity in the world, so not that much. If you think about that, the contribution of this technology could go over the 4 gigatons by 2050, and is what is expected. But the concept is, I like to see it as the journey of the air. The journey of the air is basically, our air has around 400 ppm of concentration of CO2 today. This air, is basically pushed to travel through with big fans into systems of absorption. There is liquid absorption, solid absorption. There's new technologies also that are trying to knock the CO2 from the air through electrochemical technologies. And that CO2 then is actually stored through CCS, so the storage part. Several of the technologies that we're seeing today, the storage is actually happening in basaltic formation, which is different to where we have projects like Atisa, the Northern Lights, to name few, which are actually depleted reservoirs or depleted reservoirs. The interesting part of this is that this is a mineralization process in which the CO2 becomes solid and is part of that structure, and it helps to mitigate a lot of the challenges from that. But the cost is still high. But despite of that, there is a lot of voluntary support in regarding to push this technology. So to close out, so what do we need to speed up? Wow, I mean, the formula of things that we need for speed up is back to that cocktail that I was mentioning at the beginning. We need clear and consistent and actually enforced definition of negative emission. That was on the value chains that I mentioned. We need to boost open innovation ecosystems. I mean, we invest a lot of millions and millions of dollars looking into the same. I mean, we have today the technology to network and connect and actually think about converging interests and work together and put all the money to work in a faster way, a more efficient way. The push of the renewable energy is huge. It's kind of a chicken on the egg situation because we need the renewable energy in order to generate those negative carbon solutions, because these systems actually requires energy, and that energy needs to be green. Government support and funds is, of course, on top of the chart. And I mean, things as deploying energy management system, AI, ML, that allow that smart grids can actually become more efficient in regards to the energy that we consume, could help to route green energy to support these technologies. So long story short, I mean, we have a cocktail of multiple ingredients. And what I wanted to get in here is that one of those ingredients right now is the net and is known. Repsol is working in different fronts, from CCS projects in Sacaquemac, working with SOGCI, and we can talk more about that on developing new technologies and investments, and also different new hubs and a lot of other technologies in the line of hydrogen valleys that we are opening into the north of Spain, which we already have plans approved for 60,000 barrels that are going to be feeding our system with synthetic fuels with no footprint, and among other ones like developing and pushing technologies like direct air capture, etc. And with this, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for that shutdown, suddenly shut down.
No problem. Thank you very much, Federico. And I think it worked well in the end, and came back in and focused on the role of natural solutions as well. Thank you to all our panel members. That's a really, really good overview, and we've covered some of the technologies, the scale of the issue that we're trying to grapple with, some of the concepts around investment and what we need to do in terms of creating low carbon markets. But I wanted to sort of first come back to the scale. I mean, we had some really big numbers here mentioned, and David, you highlighted the number of capture plants, 1,700 capture plants and storage plants that we need to move to. I think at the moment we're at 28 CCUS projects globally. So we have a long way to go. And I think hearing from you all, it's very clear that the technology is there. We know what we have to do, but how do we move from where we are? How do we transition from here to really the scale that we need to be moving to? So I'd be interested to hear from you. I mean, we've heard some of that about how we do it, but what do you consider to be some of the biggest barriers at the moment to scaling up, and how can we address those either individually on a national level, but also globally? And also, I thought it would be useful to touch on at COP. We heard from countries such as China and Nigeria who are interested in moving into this space. So how do we bring other countries along with us to develop CCUS globally, particularly if they now have to, we have this direction about scaling down unabated coal. So I think how do we, what are the barriers, and how do we bring those countries along? Does anyone want to come in first? If not, I will perhaps bring Syrie back in. You want to go first, Syrie?
So any particular area you would like us to pick on first, Olivia, because you covered a very broad range there.
I think some of the barriers and how we bring some of those other countries along and scale up globally would be useful. Thanks.
Right. Okay. So I think some of the barriers I think around the team we've had discussions or people have touched on. I think one of which is around actually getting the regulations in place, making it a clear business environment for business to move. Yeah. I think it's absolutely critical that there's some clarity around, what the investment environment is. Now, that can be in many ways. It can be it's around liabilities, long-term liabilities. It's around actually what is that investment model, but it's equally around actually, working government to government in places, because some of these governments will not have their own natural store. You're going to have to work across to where the geology is amenable for others. So I think David mentioned Northern Lights. We're both partners in Northern Lights. So actually transferring CO2 across international boundaries. It's actually covered at the moment by the London Protocol, which is disposal of waste at sea. So you need to make sure that that's got ratification behind it. Now that's one area that's probably the most complex, where you're sitting there saying we're going to take CO2 from one country across an international border and dispose of it and store it in another one. But actually, if you look at this and you look at scaling up, and even if you just take Europe as a body, you've got the obvious natural sink, which is the North Sea. We know it's got the right conditions. We know it's got the right geology. It's held oil and gas for millions of years. Therefore, indeed, it can hold CO2 as an unwanted gas as well. And so it's how do we actually best utilize these storage regions, if you like, for a bigger region. Yeah, and that's where that comes in. Similarly, you've got the same concept going on in Southeast Asia, where you've got similar concepts about potential transport across international borders, utilizing where we know we've got decent storage opportunities. I think, again, the piece that was mentioned is there's multiple choices countries can make about incentives. And the best ones are where there's an element of, as I put it, stick and carrot. Yeah. Stick in terms of a CO2 price, a carbon tax, other mechanisms like that. But then the carrot in terms of subsidy, a recognition of value for a lower carbon product, etc. I do think that the key thing here is subsidy will get us to a certain level. And then we really want to get those market forces driving. And so it's recognizing what can the country do to kickstart it, maybe, in terms of, like I say, both stick and carrot. But then actually, I think that the bigger thing is what can we all do to put that market force initiative behind it, that it becomes self-sustaining, because the governments can't afford to constantly be subsidizing it. So we've got to move away from that. We've got to have a plan now to move away from that to this future. Other elements that we're very active in are things like standardization. Why do I talk about that? Well, the more we can standardize in terms of shipping, loading, offloading, the more you can sit there and say, actually, we can work between the stores as they develop. And again, I'm not looking for what do we need tomorrow. This is talking about actually getting this to that full scale up for 10, 15 years time of where we really need to get to. But it means we've got to start planning it now. And we've got to start looking at this infrastructure and how you build out this infrastructure now. Yeah, because if we make the wrong choices now, then you can't do this mix and matching, and you can't look at it getting to that position in that 10, 15-year time zone. So, there's a whole heap of things I could talk about, but those are a few that you could sit there and say, well, actually, this starts layering that foundation. Yeah, and I think the other one, Zomo mentioned it, that came out of COP26, the fact that we're now layering Article 6 into this, you're positioning it that indeed we can start talking about credits from one country being transferable, etc. And finally, before I let one of my other colleagues talk, negative emissions. Yeah, negative emissions and getting a value for those negative emissions is going to be huge. As you can tell, I can probably rattle away for a long time, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That's, it was a broad question, but you've covered quite a lot of areas there. And I know we're working with industry on that standardization point and trying to ensure that as we develop shipping, for example, that we start, we really think about it now in terms of how that will operate between stores and how we'll be able to work together. And it's, I think there's a mix between sort of working with the specifics of the geological store that you're working with, but also understanding the others that are being developed and where we can sort of standardize and do that. And I think we have an opportunity now because we are developing this industry. There's a huge opportunity to do it at this point, and we need to put the effort in now rather than go forward and retro. It would obviously be much more difficult. David, I didn't know if you wanted to come in here. I mean, Syrie covered some of the issues around, the need and some of the barriers around investment and looking at those longer term liabilities and cross-border liabilities. Is there anything you wanted to come in here in particular with some of the major barriers to investment?
What explained Syrie is clear that what we see. What we see for the business of CCS development is I would not add not a lot of things because Syrie covered a lot of topics, and we all agree what Syrie said. And I just add one point. It's clear that we see that in some countries the commitment of we say low carbon economy is quite new, and now they have to deploy this commitment in terms of execution. And how the industries in this country will have will decarbonize their industry, and how they consider CO2 capture and CO2 storage as a solution. It will need time for that, and we have to wait and to be more patient before seeing additional CCS project in this area. And we know that for CCS project it takes a lot of time. So as you have to identify CO2 storage, identify the CCS shell, and most of the projects take more between 8 to 10 years. So it's clear that for 2030, and we say we're not very optimistic that we will tackle the ambition of the 800 million ton per annum by 2030. But we will see that this wave is coming now in the different countries, and it's clear that underlying Syrie regulation framework in this country is very key. And in addition, with the value of the CO2.
Thank you. And Federico, I was going to ask if you wanted to come in on that, the point around creating value for negative emissions. You touched on the difference between natural mechanisms, trees and how you measure it, and the longevity of that, but compared to negative emissions and the permanence of the technologies that you were talking about. Do you want to add anything in terms of the how do we actually value those and create that market for them?
Sure. I mean, actually, I would like to make an example, because I think that we should voice a lot of the things that we are doing already. I'm gonna bring to the table the OGCI situation. No? So the OGCI, which is the Oil and Gas Climate Investments Initiative, actually is a group of 12 members that are investing around $7 billion a year, and that they represent like the 30% of the production, oil and gas operating production globally. Actually, Total is in there. This group, and you were in the question, you actually were talking about also how do you help some countries of Africa, etc. But this group, I mean, specifically, is not only promoting to developing the development of CCUS hubs. I mean, like the T side actually is one of this one actually starting that OGCI conversations. But they have been mapping for quite some time all of the big emission sources and all of the potential storage sources and putting them together to understand what is a prioritization from a global standpoint of all of the carbon capture storage projects that could be done. Making so in regards to what we can do, so making this type of information more visible and actually helping with lessons learned that we are getting from countries that are highly sponsoring from regulations and like Norway and UK, these countries that are still framing their regulatory is key. Another line more in the technology, I mean, is that 45% of also that investment that I was talking, it goes to promote technologies in the areas of capturing of the CO2, which is right now, I mean, one of the highest cost part of all the process to get into the storage. So that ties to how to do it. So I think the open innovation concepts in which you bring all the startups, I mean, it's a great ideas out there in terms of technology, and we can push them through this type of initiative is great. I think initiatives, at least one should just go over the horizon of oil and gas and go into all type of industry and step by step promote them. But we have a challenge. David was saying it. I mean, I fear we are not going to get. I mean, by 250, we are talking about the 300 millions of tons to be in carbon capture storage, and one project takes name it 7 to 10 years. Regulatory be on the critical path. So we need to target how to shorten that time and how to activate, as Syrie was mentioned, the portfolio of activity. How do you actually build a portfolio of CCS projects that are going and running in parallel in all Europe and in the globe?
Thank you. Thanks. I did want to quickly address the ugly in the title, and we've had a question in saying, is relying on sales of fossil fuel to support a technology which is an element of a policy designed to reduce the use of fossil fuels ultimately self-defeating? Does anyone want to come in and answer? Zomo, do you want to come in on that one?
I think I think it's a very good question, but the reality of it is that in the hard-to-abate industries, CCS is going to be the cheapest option to enable those industries to continue to produce and use oil and gas as a feedstock whilst ensuring that they're zero carbon. So I think it's just a reality of the economics of different options that we have on the table for the world to get to a net zero picture. Oil and gas has to be in that mix, but it has to be used responsibly, and it has to be used with a zero emissions at the point of combustion. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think is really important, is this, on Syrie's note and Federico's note about the value of the negative emission reduction. We can't forget that there is a growing market for low carbon feedstocks, for carbon neutral produced products, whether that's cement or aluminium or steel. And I think if we're able to create a premiumization in the market for differentiated commodities, whether that's cement produced with zero emissions, we're able to then have an additional incentive to deploy CCS. And I think that's already happening in some sectors like aluminium, for example, where we're seeing a new version of aluminium, a lower carbon aluminium, put onto the market and achieving a differential price point. So I think this pull factor from customers is going to also really help us upstream to install CCS.
Yeah, and I really liked Syrie's graphic and suggestion of the the marking that we've got so used to on our white products of A to G, and there's a very easy model there that we can replicate and move out across low carbon products that people will understand and seek to use. So it really it's there. I think. I wondered if there was anything that anyone wanted to add. We're very coming to the end of the session, but of lessons that we could learn from renewables. We heard a lot about in terms of subsidy, but we're perhaps 20 years behind. Anything that we can where we are now in a position where there is a clear market and they're self-sustaining. Any clear lessons there? Just a couple of points that we think that should be applied to CCUS from lessons learned. David, shall I come to you? Oh, I don't think we have David. Federico.
Sure. I think we have a big lesson learned about the renewables back in 2007. I think there was a lot of write-off, let's say, from companies in regards to investments on renewable and not being in not a market, but a business that was supporting all those investments. I think that goes back to the point of Syrie on the lessons learned and say that you need to make this sustainable. Yes, true. I mean, we can put, you got the European funds putting 750 billions of euros to try to fast track the economy to a low carbon economy. But the big lesson learning here, I believe, is going into the economic model. We're going to be able to make these commitments on pushing these projects, even taking a risk on whether or not they're generating cash. But the bottom line is that the carbon taxes mechanism, ETS, voluntary markets, the price needs to get also to a point in which it makes sense, so that we don't face similar situation. I believe in any case that the push is different too. We have a point now on the table that is that kind of the citizen of the world, that each of us has an opportunity here to make a change, and there is pressure because of believing in a sustainable world, and that should be the overarching argument about any economics and any actions.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think we are now out of time. So I want to thank each of our panel members for such interesting contributions. I think the session will be available afterwards. Thank you for some of the questions that were put through, but I think it's really helped to emphasize the scale of ambition and the scale of that we need to grow the industry by rapidly in the next 10 years. And there's a huge opportunity here. So thank you very much to all our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.